The large intestine is the next stop for what's left over after chemical digestion and absorption has occurred. And what we call that stuff that's left over is food residue. And just so you know, the large intestine is called the large intestine because it has a larger diameter lumen. The small intestine, even though it's considerably longer than the large intestine, is called the small intestine because the diameter of the lumen is much smaller. So the large intestine, as you know, is located distal to the small intestine, and it has a unique way of laying in the abdomen in that it kind of forms sort of a box, a three-sided box, almost a four-sided, in fact, box around the small intestine. The small intestine would be located in this area and is kind of wrapped on most sides by the large intestine. So the regions of the large intestine include the portion that intersects directly with the small intestine. That's called the cecum. It's kind of this large portion. That's where we find the appendix, which is a evolutionarily left over structure, if you will. It doesn't serve a role really too much anymore. It was believed that it used to be a location for bacteria to exist in a time when we used to eat a lot more plant material in our diet. And since we don't have digestive enzymes to break down cellular plant cell walls, the cellulose, those bacteria would do that job for us. Now that our diets consist less of vegetative matter and more of things like meat, we don't necessarily need the appendix, so it's sort of a leftover from our previous evolutionary history from millions of years ago. The next region of the large intestine is this portion here. I'm drawing in an arrow. This is called the ascending colon. And then we turn across into the transverse colon. And then we make a turn downwards into the descending colon. And then this last portion here you can see kind of has sort of a twisted appearance to it. This is the sigmoid colon. The last portion of the large intestine is this kind of sac-like region here. That's called the rectum. And then distal to that is the internal rectal sphincter or anal sphincter and the external anal sphincter. The internal anal sphincter is made of smooth muscle tissue. The external anal sphincter is made of skeletal muscle tissue. This is very similar to the pattern we saw with the internal and external urethral sphincters in the urinary system. Okay, the main jobs of the large intestine are these: to absorb the last bits of water out of the food residue. The process of chemical digestion requires a lot of water. Most of that water gets reabsorbed in the small intestine, but the last bits of it are reabsorbed in the large intestine. And really, that's one of the biggest jobs the large intestine has to do, is just to reclaim that last bit of water out of the forming feces. It also has another job, which is to propel the food residue forward towards the sigmoid colon and rectum. And then the other job it has is to eliminate feces from the body. And the amount of time that food residue spends in the large intestine can vary by individual, but it's usually estimated to be about 12 to 24 hours, unless you've got some sort of health issue or whatever. But if you're normal and healthy and not stressed out or anything, 12 to 24 hours is the typical amount of time. There are some unique features to the large intestine, and you'll probably learn about some of these in lab. There are still a large amount of smooth muscle tissue, but it's limited. Rather than having just a complete longitudinal layer of smooth muscle tissue, in addition to the circular layer, the longitudinal layer of smooth muscle tissue has been reduced to this little band-like structure. So rather than covering over the entire surface of the large intestine, it's just in a band. That's called the teniae coli And as a result of that, there's far more of the circular smooth muscle tissue. And because there's a lot more smooth muscle tissue than there is a longitudinal, you get this sort of puckering appearance to the large intestine. Those puckers are called haustra. That's plural, and haustrum is the singular. Now, this picture here shows you, kind of a nice, neat, and orderly view of what the ideal large intestine would look like. Here's a real picture from a patient, and what I want you to see is that the large intestine here is kind of in this pinkish reddish color, and that it does not, follow a nice, neat pattern as you would expect. Yes, it does have an ascending portion, a transverse portion, a descending portion, and a sigmoid portion, but it sure doesn't look as simple as what you see over here. So just remember that the pictures that you're seeing in your book are drawn to make it easy for you to identify structures, but that's not exactly what things always look like in a patient. Let me just say a couple things about the haustra. The haustra, these pocket-like sacs, are there to help propel the food residue forward on its journey towards the sigmoid colon. So they do these kind of rhythmic, slow contractions that slowly move the food residue forward as more and more water is absorbed. And then 3 or 4 times a day we have what are called mass peristalsis movements that move massive amounts of food residue forward into the rectum. This often happens in response to stomach filling. So as you start to eat a meal and your stomach fills, something called a gastrocolic reflex takes place, which involves signals reaching the large intestine to inform it, hey, the stomach is filling with food. Why don't you propel the food residue forward into the rectum so that there's room to receive the new incoming food after it goes through the small intestine. Really quickly, I want to just compare some of the major differences between the large and small intestine. As I already mentioned, the luminal size varies. The small intestine has a smaller diameter lumen. The large intestine has a larger diameter lumen. The large intestine is missing some features that the small intestine has. For example, the epithelial cells in the large intestine do not have microvilli. Okay, so no microvilli. There are no villi either. And what that should tell you is that obviously massive amounts of absorption is not as important here. Okay, because the microvilli and villi are there to increase surface area and thus promote more efficient absorption. So large intestine just isn't as involved with absorption of things like nutrients. All it's doing is absorbing a little bit of water, and that's it. It has almost no secretory cells, the kinds of cells that would be secreting things like digestive enzymes, for example. What it does have is a lot of mucus. So it's got to have a lot of goblet cells to make all that mucus. And the purpose of that mucus is to lubricate the passageway so that the feces can move more readily through the large intestine. Remember, the more water we're drawing out, the thicker that feces is becoming, the more difficult it would be for it to move through the large intestine unless we had some sort of lubricant like mucus to assist. There are also present in the large intestine a whole bunch of bacterial flora, lots of different types of bacteria. And they serve a number of jobs. One thing they do is any carbohydrates that you could not digest in your small intestine, for example, cellulose, we cannot digest cellulose, gets digested by bacteria that are residing in the large intestine. That's great, except for in the process of doing that, they produce a lot of things like methane gas, and that can lead to flatulence, okay? And also, it results in the release of some different types of metabolic acids. We're not going to worry about that too much. These bacteria also manufacture very small amounts of vitamins B and K. Some researchers believe that those vitamins B and K get absorbed in the large intestine and help to nourish us with those vitamins. There are other researchers who argue that the amounts made are so incredibly tiny as to really have no effect on us in terms of vitamin levels in the body. Who knows who's right? So let's talk very quickly about the process by which feces are voided from the body. This is the process of defecation. And what happens in defecation is that first we have that mass peristalsis that's usually a result of that gastrocolic reflex. And when we have, in other words, food entering into the stomach that is causing this mass peristalsis movement in the large intestine, that's propelling those food residues, that feces, forward to the rectum. And when that food residue gets into the rectum, it causes the rectum to stretch. There are mechanoreceptors in the rectum that then send signals indicating that stretching sensation. They send signals off to the spinal cord. And the spinal cord then has an interneurons that evaluate that information and in response send out an outgoing motor signal or effector signal to the rectum, signaling it to contract. Okay, and at the same time, it's also sending signals to things like the internal anal sphincter, telling it to relax or open. Now, the external anal sphincter also gets a signal to relax, but our higher order centers of the brain can override that signal and basically control the external anal sphincter, keeping it in a contracted state and only permitting it to relax when it's socially appropriate to defecate, so only when you're in the bathroom. So that control of the external anal sphincter is voluntary. We can decide when to actually relax the external anal sphincter. To assist with the defecation process, the actual contraction and movement of the feces out of the body, we can utilize something called the Valsalva maneuver. And the Valsalva maneuver is the same kind of maneuver that's used when women are bearing down during childbirth. And it involves taking a big, deep breath of air and then closing the mouth, holding that breath, and pushing downward onto the abdomen. And what that does is it increases the pressure on the abdomen and on places like the rectum, and that helps to push the feces out of the body, or if we're in labor and delivery, it helps to push the baby out of the birth canal. Valsalva maneuver also transiently will elevate things like blood pressure, and it's not totally unusual in the elderly to have during excess straining to defecate, which often happens because older people can get constipated, then they begin to really strain when they're trying to defecate. They'll perform a Valsalva maneuver, and as a result of the elevation, the transient elevation in blood pressure, can actually experience either a heart attack or a stroke in the brain as a result.